In the damp shadow of the northern woods, the Pritchard cabin sat like a wound in the earth, hidden behind centuries of overgrowth and whispered rumors. No one remembered who first dared speak of the family, and over the decades, their name became a ghost story, something children shivered over at night. Then, in 1993, everything changed. In the early spring of 1993, a sense of unease settled over the quiet town of Millfield, though no one could yet place the source of the tension. The Pritchard family had long existed at the edge of local memory, their name whispered only when children were told cautionary tales, their existence bordering on myth. Most townspeople assumed the family had simply disappeared into the forest generations ago, leaving behind the cabin that had decayed into near invisibility beneath creeping vines and the relentless growth of underbrush. It was during this time that the authorities, acting on a tip from a distant relative who had grown concerned after years of silence, arrived at the cabin for the first time in decades. What they found inside was something no one could have predicted, and something that would shake the very foundation of the town's perception of safety and normalcy. The cabin itself, though small and dilapidated, seemed to exude an unnatural presence, as if the forest around it were alive with watchful intent. When the officers pushed the door open, the air that escaped carried the scent of old wood, damp earth, and something more pungent, an odor that hinted at long-term confinement and decay. Inside, 6 children were discovered, their bodies gaunt, clothing torn and filthy, hair matted, and skin pale from years of little sunlight. Their eyes, wide with terror, darted between the newcomers and the shadows of the cabin, as if expecting the walls themselves to lash out. Each child clung desperately to the remnants of whatever comfort they could find, trembling and muttering incoherent words. It quickly became evident that these children had been left to grow in a world entirely of their own making, isolated and untouched by human society for years. Authorities noted immediately that the children's environment was unlike any typical neglect case. The cabin bore evidence of prolonged survival in near-total isolation. Makeshift beds, sparse and spoiled food, and walls scratched with symbols that suggested more than mere boredom or childish play. The children's interactions were strange, their movements cautious, their understanding of social norms fractured, as if the boundaries of childhood had been rewritten by fear itself. Interviews were slow and painstaking. As the children's memories were fragmented, their voices trembling while they recounted shadows and figures, strange sounds at night, and a strict hierarchy imposed by absent guardians who had ruled over them with an almost ritualistic intensity. Townspeople who came to see the children reported an almost palpable aura of dread surrounding the cabin, a sensation that the forest itself seemed to recoil from their presence, leaving an echo of something ancient and malevolent. The discovery of the Pritchard children did more than reveal a case of extreme neglect. It tore open a wound in the town's collective memory, reviving rumors of vanished children over the decades, whispers of families lost to the woods, and the unsettling idea that the Pritchard's seclusion had never been entirely natural. The town, which had always preferred to ignore the forest's depths, could no longer deny that something sinister had persisted there, shaping the lives of those unfortunate enough to fall under its influence. And the children themselves were the first undeniable proof that the darkness of the Pritchard legacy had survived unbroken into 1993 after the initial shock of finding the 6 Pritchard children subsided. Investigators turned their attention to the cabin itself, realizing that the structure held far more than signs of neglect or isolation. The walls were etched with strange symbols, deep grooves carved into the wood, as if someone had deliberately attempted to communicate in a language no one alive could fully comprehend. Some markings resembled archaic letters, others twisted shapes that seemed almost alive when stared at too long, moving in the corner of the eye. Burn marks on the floor and ceiling suggested that fires had been lit in precise, ritualistic patterns rather than for warmth or cooking. Scattered around the cabin were remnants of journals, diaries, and scraps of paper, each containing cryptic passages, repetitive chants, and references to keeping the town's secrets alive and watching over what must not be lost. The sheer number of these writings suggested obsessive dedication, a life governed by a devotion to something far older and darker than mere superstition. It quickly became clear that the cabin had not been merely a home. It had been a controlled environment, a place where the Pritchard family had isolated themselves and the children for a purpose that remained obscure but unmistakably sinister. The children themselves, when coaxed into speaking, revealed fragmented recollections of ceremonies performed at odd hours, instructions they were forced to memorize, and warnings never to speak of certain things outside the cabin. Their fragmented descriptions hinted at shadowy figures, cloaked in secrecy, appearing at the edge of their perception, sometimes whispering, sometimes standing silently, as if keeping watch. Investigators noted that the children's fear was not only of the forest or the cabin, but of what the family had represented, as though the children had grown up under the influence of a presence far beyond their comprehension. Among the scattered items, investigators found objects that suggested a disturbing combination of superstition, ritual, and perhaps even attempts at supernatural contact. Small figurines, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and ritualistic markings aligned with the journal's instructions, forming a pattern of behavior that had persisted for years, likely decades. Some of the children indicated that these rituals were meant to protect the family, yet no explanation could reconcile the innocence of their youth with the intensity of the practices. The very act of survival within this space had been a form of indoctrination, a slow shaping of the children's perception of the world and of themselves. The more investigators examined the cabin, the more it became evident that the Pritchard family's isolation had not been an accident of circumstance, but a deliberate design. The symbols, fires, and writings pointed toward a purpose steeped in secrecy, one that seemed intertwined with the town itself, hinting at knowledge or power passed down through generations. Each discovery raised more questions than answers, suggesting that the cabin was not just a home, but a repository of a hidden knowledge that had been preserved through fear, devotion, and obsession. Every mark, every journal, and every terrified memory of the children was a thread in a web of darkness that stretched beyond the cabin's walls, threatening to entangle the town in the legacy of the Pritchard's secret world. The discovery of the Pritchard children sent shockwaves through the town, and almost immediately, the quiet routines of Millfield were disrupted by a pervasive unease. Rumors that had once been confined to hushed conversations at kitchen tables or fleeting mentions in the local diner now took on a terrifying new weight. People began to recall children who had disappeared over the decades, names that had been forgotten except by the oldest residents, and whispers of strange occurrences near the forest's edge. Mothers clutched their own children a little tighter, neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, and even long-trusted friends avoided conversations that might dredge up the town's buried memories. The town itself seemed to exhale tension as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for the Pritchard cabin to reveal what had long lurked in its shadow. As local law enforcement continued their investigation, a growing realization emerged that the children were not just victims of neglect, but had been kept within a system that was calculated, ritualistic, and almost impossible to comprehend. The eerie symbols etched into the cabin walls, the journals chronicling years of obsessive behavior, and the children's fragmented, terrified stories painted a picture of a family operating under a self-imposed set of rules that seemed to exist outside normal morality. Townspeople began to wonder aloud whether the Pritchards had acted alone or if their influence had reached further than anyone had dared imagine. Older residents recalled seeing strange figures in the forest decades prior, but they had dismissed them as imagination or the result of alcohol and superstition. Now, those fleeting memories returned with weight, suggesting that the Pritchards' isolation may have been part of a larger pattern that had been tolerated, or even aided, by the town's residents. Fear and fascination mingled in equal measure as media crews descended on Millfield. Reporters dug through public records, trying to connect old missing persons cases to the children now found in the cabin. The story quickly became national news, and with each article, the town's fragile sense of security unraveled further. People whispered about neighbors they had always trusted, wondering if anyone had known more than they admitted. Some claimed to have seen children in the forest in years past, while others insisted that entire families had covered up incidents to maintain the town's outward appearance of normalcy. The forest, once a place of recreation and quiet, took on a menacing aura. Paths that had seemed safe during childhood hikes were now avoided, and the shadowed tree became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that whatever had been happening at the Pritchard cabin may have touched far more lives than anyone was willing to admit. The discovery forced Millfield to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between safety and horror had always been thinner than they believed. Fear was no longer abstract. It was tangible, embedded in the knowledge that the children's captivity had gone unnoticed for years, and that the events at the cabin were likely only the surface of something far older. In the weeks following the rescue, the town's social fabric began to fray as suspicion, dread, and a growing awareness of past complicity spread. Families who had once been pillars of the community were quietly scrutinized, long-hidden grudges resurfaced, and an undercurrent of paranoia settled into daily life, leaving everyone to wonder whether the darkness that had claimed the Pritchard children had ever truly left the town at all. As the investigation into the Pritchard cabin deepened, authorities made a discovery that would escalate the town's unease into something bordering on panic. Beneath the cabin, partially hidden by years of dirt and decay, they found the entrance to a narrow tunnel, its opening disguised by a false floorboard that had long gone unnoticed. The moment they pried it open, a chill seemed to pour from the earth itself, carrying with it the stale scent of soil, rot, and something older, a presence that made even the most hardened officers pause. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing walls scarred with scratches and faint, arcane markings, echoing the symbols found on the cabin's surfaces. The tunnel was not simply a hiding place. It was a deliberate passage, carved meticulously over time, twisting beneath the forest floor and vanishing into darkness that seemed to stretch far beyond what maps or memory could record. As they ventured further, investigators discovered remnants of lives long forgotten. Old toys, journals, photographs of children who had disappeared over decades, and personal items that had been assumed lost or stolen were scattered along the passage, as if each generation of victims had been collected and preserved for reasons no one alive could understand. The air grew thicker with every step, as though the earth itself bore witness to the horrors that had taken place above. The children's testimonies suddenly gained clarity. They described secret passages, hidden spaces beneath the cabin, and instructions to remain silent at all costs, to obey rules they did not fully comprehend. The tunnel was more than an escape route or hiding place. It was a controlled environment, a subterranean extension of the cabin itself, where the Pritchards had concealed their activities from the prying eyes of the world. The discovery sent ripples through the town. Elder residents recalled unexplained disappearances and fleeting sightings of children near the forest's edge, incidents that had always been shrugged off as accidents or the overactive imagination of children. Now, those vague memories gained a horrifying new significance. The notion that the Pritchards might have had access to a network of underground spaces, possibly extending beyond the cabin and into the woods themselves, suggested a level of premeditation that made the family's previous secrecy almost terrifying in its sophistication. It became evident that these tunnels were not built for comfort or convenience. They were constructed with precision, perhaps to serve a purpose that was ritualistic or strategic, intended to isolate, manipulate, and conceal. Investigators also noted subtle clues embedded in the tunnel, symbols matching those in the journals, remnants of makeshift seating or arrangements that implied gatherings, and faint traces of something that might have been smoke or incense. It became increasingly clear that what had been discovered in the cabin was only the tip of a far-reaching secret, and the tunnel served as a physical and symbolic extension of the Pritchards' world, a dark, labyrinthine network that had connected their family to the children they controlled and, perhaps, to the town itself. Each step down the tunnel amplified the sense that the family's reach and the horrors it concealed were far older and more elaborate than anyone could have imagined, and that the surface reality the town had lived in for decades was built upon layers of hidden, unspeakable truths as authorities began to piece together the events inside the Pritchard cabin and the labyrinthine tunnel beneath it. The children themselves became the most crucial, yet most fragile, sources of information. Their memories were fragmented, often hazy, and sometimes contradictory, but through careful observation and patient questioning, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The children spoke in whispers, their voices trembling with fear that had been honed over years of confinement, of shadows that moved without source and figures that appeared at the edge of their perception, watching their every action. Some described hearing chants echoing through the cabin at night, words they did not understand but that seemed to carry power, words that, when repeated, drew the attention of the unseen. They spoke of rules so rigid that breaking them, even unintentionally, resulted in punishment that was never physical but far more insidious, a deep, paralyzing fear that seemed to ripple through their minds and bodies. These accounts, though fragmented, suggested a life dictated by a presence that none of the children could identify, yet all obeyed instinctively. They described being forced to remain in certain positions for hours, to perform tasks in exacting sequences, and to memorize rules that governed not just behavior but thought. When asked about their parents, the children often fell silent, their eyes flicking nervously toward walls or corners, as if the very air might be listening. It became evident that the Pritchards themselves had been both caregivers and enforcers, but that their authority had been bolstered by something far older, something that existed beyond human comprehension. Some children muttered about the Watchers or the Forest People, phrases that seemed to hint at a supernatural or ritualistic influence, though even they could not articulate what those terms truly meant. The trauma in their recounting was palpable. Even small triggers, a shadow passing through a doorway, a distant howl in the woods, could cause them to freeze or regress into silent trembling. Investigators realized that the fear instilled in the children had been meticulously cultivated, a combination of isolation, ritual, and psychological manipulation designed to prevent rebellion or escape. Yet within these whispered stories, glimpses of resilience emerged. The children often banded together in secret, comforting one another and finding small ways to resist the omnipresent fear, whether through quiet gestures or shared memories of a life outside the cabin, however faint those memories had become. As the adults around them began to record these testimonies, it became clear that the children were revealing more than just their own suffering. They were offering a map of the Pritchards' world, a world in which the forest, the cabin, and the unseen forces interwove to create a system of control and secrecy. Every detail, every hesitant recollection of voices, figures, and rituals painted a chilling image of a family enmeshed in a darkness that had persisted for generations. The children's memories suggested that what the investigators were seeing in the cabin and tunnel was merely a fragment of a far larger, ongoing pattern, one that reached beyond the walls of the home and into the hidden history of the town itself. Just as the investigation into the Pritchard cabin and the underground tunnels seemed to reach a dead end, an unexpected figure returned to Millfield, a retired journalist named Leonard Hayes, whose presence sent ripples of curiosity and unease through the town. Leonard had once been a promising reporter decades earlier, known for his relentless pursuit of stories that others dared not touch. He had left Millfield under a cloud of frustration after uncovering fragments of the Pritchard family's dark history, only to be silenced by threats, warnings, and a combination of disbelief and resistance from the town's older generation. Now, drawn back by the rescue of the children and the renewed attention on the Pritchards, he brought with him old notes, faded photographs, and copies of documents he had collected long before the world knew of the cabin's horrors. His arrival marked a turning point in the case, as Leonard's research revealed that the Pritchard family had been under scrutiny for decades, their unusual behaviors documented by law enforcement and curious townsfolk alike, yet repeatedly dismissed or quietly covered up. Leonard explained that his own family had once attempted to investigate the Pritchards, uncovering records of disappearances, missing children, and strange symbols etched into forest trees and town structures. Those findings had been largely ignored, and in some cases deliberately hidden by local authorities and prominent families who feared exposure. He recounted how the Pritchards were never merely isolated. They were deeply enmeshed in a network of secrecy that spanned generations, connecting them to the town itself in ways no one had suspected. Through Leonard's documents and his recollections, a clearer picture began to emerge. The Pritchards' strange rituals, their obsession with the forest, and the symbols carved into the cabin walls were part of a much larger system, one that had been preserved over decades. The documents included letters between local officials, cryptic newspaper clippings, and photographs showing early disappearances that had never been solved. These items suggested a chilling continuity, that the Pritchards' actions were not anomalies but deliberate extensions of a practice older than the town, a practice that had been tolerated, ignored, or actively concealed to maintain the fragile peace and reputation of Millfield. Leonard's insight also provided context to the children's fragmented testimonies. The shadowy figures, the whispered rules, and the fear that had shaped the Pritchards' captive children were not isolated phenomena, but part of a family legacy that had persisted through calculated teaching and coercion. The retired journalist's knowledge of the town's past, combined with his access to long-forgotten documents, gave investigators the first real understanding that the Pritchard family had been operating under the guidance of forces, social, psychological, and possibly supernatural, that extended far beyond the cabin and the immediate forest. With Leonard's return, the investigation shifted from a case of child rescue to a larger, more harrowing inquiry into the town's history, exposing the uncomfortable reality that the Pritchards' darkness had been nurtured, protected, and perhaps even sanctioned by the very community that now claimed shock and horror. In the weeks following Leonard Hay's return and the resurfacing of the Pritchard case, the town of Millfield began to experience disturbances that could not be explained by rational means. At first, they were subtle, shadows flickering in empty streets at dusk, the faint sound of whispering voices carried on the wind, and the occasional glimpse of figures standing at the forest's edge, vanishing before anyone could approach. Residents who had lived their entire lives in the town reported an uneasy sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes were tracking their movements. Children refused to play near certain areas of the woods, and pets would growl or flee at invisible presences. What had been a story confined to history and rumor was now manifesting in ways that felt immediate, personal, and threatening. The most unnerving development came in the form of markings that appeared seemingly overnight in the town square and along the outskirts of streets near the forest. These symbols were identical to those etched into the cabin walls and the tunnel below, executed with precision and familiarity, as if someone, or something, was deliberately sending a message. Authorities were baffled, and townspeople whispered theories ranging from pranksters to cult activity. But a growing number feared that the Pritchards' influence had somehow extended beyond the cabin and forest, reaching into the very heart of the town. Alongside the symbols, unexplained howls echoed from the woods at night, low and guttural, carrying a cadence that sounded almost like communication. And in the darkness, some swore they could see shapes moving between the trees, impossibly fast, vanishing the moment one tried to focus. The children's accounts suddenly made sense in ways that were terrifying. Their memories of shadowy watchers, cryptic chants, and unseen presences were not isolated to the cabin. The same patterns seemed to have emerged in the town itself. Leonard Hayes noted the uncanny parallels to documents he had uncovered decades earlier, detailing unexplained events and minor disappearances that had been dismissed or covered up. It was as if the town itself were an extension of the Pritchards' dark world, and the recent manifestations were only a continuation of a cycle that had persisted for generations. With each passing day, fear and paranoia began to spread like wildfire. Families who had once trusted one another now questioned the intentions of neighbors. Shops reported unusual activity after hours, and even town officials began to wonder whether the disturbances were humanly possible. Some residents attempted to rationalize the occurrences, attributing them to wind, animals, or natural phenomena, but rational explanations failed to account for the symbols' sudden appearance, their precise mimicry of the cabin markings, and the synchronized patterns of the sounds echoing from the forest. What had begun as whispers in the dark had become undeniable proof. The Pritchards' legacy was not confined to a single cabin, nor to the children they had kept hidden. Something older, more persistent, and far more insidious had taken root in the very soil of Millfield, threatening to consume anyone who ventured too close to the truth. As the strange occurrences in Millfield intensified, evidence began to surface that suggested the town's oldest families had long been complicit in concealing the Pritchards' activities. Documents uncovered by Leonard Hayes revealed a disturbing pattern of omissions, deliberate misreporting, and hidden records that stretched back decades. Missing children, unexplained disappearances, and unusual sightings had often been quietly dismissed by law enforcement, sometimes under the direction of town officials who feared scandal or the unraveling of their carefully maintained social order. The deeper investigators delved, the clearer it became that the Pritchards' isolation had not been an anomaly, but had existed within a framework of secrecy that the town had tacitly supported, whether out of fear, self-interest, or a desire to preserve its reputation. Interviews with longtime residents painted a chilling picture. Elders spoke in hushed tones of warnings given to families. Don't ask, don't look, don't speak. Phrases that echoed the Pritchards' own insistence on silence within the cabin. Some claimed to have witnessed strange gatherings in the woods, children being guided away from public view, and symbols carved into trees along the forest's periphery. But no one had acted, and those who had spoken were quickly silenced by social pressure or the unspoken threat of ostracism. The town council itself had records of complaints and observations, but these documents were buried in dusty archives, hidden from public scrutiny, and often altered to erase any trace of wrongdoing. The Pritchards' rituals and obsessive behaviors, it seemed, were known in fragments to those in power, yet the full scope had been deliberately ignored, creating an environment in which the family could operate unchecked for decades. This realization unsettled even those who had initially felt safe in the knowledge that the children were rescued. The town's complicity meant that the horror was not confined to the cabin or the forest. It had been embedded within the social fabric of Millfield itself. Every family that had turned a blind eye, every official who had prioritized reputation over justice, had unwittingly allowed the cycle of fear, control, and secrecy to persist. It became clear that the Pritchards were both perpetrators and products of a system designed to contain knowledge, to preserve the legacy of darkness without challenging the town's surface appearance of normalcy. Even as investigators documented the children's testimonies and mapped the network of tunnels and symbols, a sense of betrayal settled over the community. The town's elders had maintained the Pritchard secrets, whether out of reverence, fear, or self-preservation, and the truth that emerged threatened to shatter the illusion of safety that Millfield had long relied upon. The realization that complicity had been systemic, that the darkness was not confined to the Pritchard family alone, created an atmosphere of distrust, suspicion, and dread, leaving the town to confront the grim fact that the legacy of the Pritchards' practices had been nurtured, protected, and perhaps even encouraged by those who should have stopped it. Driven by the mounting evidence and the children's fragmented memories, a team of investigators, accompanied by Leonard Hayes and a few of the town's most determined officials, ventured deep into the forest surrounding the Pritchard cabin. The forest, long considered merely dense and foreboding, now revealed itself as something far more sinister, a living maze that seemed intent on concealing whatever lay within. Every step into the undergrowth brought a creeping unease. Twisted roots clawed at boots, shadows shifted unnaturally, and the wind carried strange murmurs, faint enough to be dismissed yet persistent enough to unsettle the senses. The children, though now rescued from the cabin, pointed out landmarks they had remembered, leading the group toward a clearing where the forest appeared to bend unnaturally around what seemed to be an overgrown structure half swallowed by moss and earth. The structure itself was unlike anything recorded in local history. Stone foundations suggested human construction, yet the shape and layout were irregular, almost organic, as if the builders had allowed the forest to guide their hands. Within its ruins, investigators discovered evidence of long-abandoned rituals, circles etched into stone, remnants of fires, and small artifacts arranged in deliberate patterns, mirroring the symbols found inside the cabin. Faded inscriptions on walls and stones hinted at practices and beliefs that reached beyond the Pritchard family, suggesting that the rituals performed in the cabin had once been part of a larger, older tradition. It became clear that the Pritchards had not invented the practices they carried out. They had inherited them, preserving and continuing a system that had existed in the forest long before anyone in the town could remember. As the group explored further, strange phenomena began to manifest, subtle at first, and then increasingly difficult to ignore. Whispered voices, indecipherable yet unmistakable, seemed to echo from the stones themselves, while fleeting shadows danced at the edge of vision. Investigators reported feeling watched, a pervasive sensation that grew heavier as they neared the heart of the ruins. Even the children, who had survived years of fear, reacted with hesitation and dread, pointing out areas that looked wrong or where they come out. It was as if the forest and the remnants of the structure were still alive with the influence of the Pritchard's long-standing rituals, responding to the presence of outsiders in ways that defied natural explanation. Every artifact, every marking, and every whispered memory converged to paint a chilling narrative. The Pritchard's cabin was not an isolated site of horror, but a branch of a network of ritualistic spaces embedded in the forest, each connected to the other by tradition, secrecy, and a lingering, almost sentient darkness. The investigators realized that they were not merely uncovering history. They were confronting a living legacy, a continuation of practices that had shaped the lives of countless children and influenced the town itself for generations. The deeper they ventured into the ruins, the more the line between observer and participant blurred, leaving them to grapple with the undeniable truth that the forest had long been a repository of fear, and the Pritchards were only its most recent stewards. As the investigation reached its climax, the full scope of the Pritchard legacy began to crystallize, revealing a truth far more horrifying than anyone in Millfield could have imagined. The tunnels beneath the cabin, the symbols etched into walls and trees, the artifacts in the ruined structure deep in the forest, all pointed to a deliberate, centuries-long system of secrecy, manipulation, and ritual that was intimately tied to the very foundation of the town. What had begun as a case of missing children evolved into an exposure of something ancient and pervasive, a darkness that had silently shaped the lives of generations. The Pritchards, terrifying as their actions were, had been part of a larger cycle, one that transcended individual families and insinuated itself into the social and psychological framework of the entire community. Through the children's testimonies, Leonard Hayes' research, and the painstaking examination of the forest ruins, investigators pieced together a chilling realization. The Pritchards' rituals were not simply for power, protection, or superstition. They were part of a system designed to feed and sustain an influence older than the town itself. This influence seemed almost alive, responsive to fear and obedience, demanding secrecy and silence, and extending beyond the cabin and forest into the town's institutions, families, and social hierarchies. Each disappearance, each hidden child, and each symbol carved into the woods or the cabin was a link in a chain connecting the Pritchards to something ineffable, a cycle that had been maintained through generations with meticulous care and deliberate oversight. The town's oldest families, once viewed as pillars of society, were now revealed to have been complicit in sustaining this cycle. Whether motivated by fear, self-interest, or a sense of duty to preserve a dangerous tradition, they had allowed the Pritchards' practices to continue unchallenged, leaving children vulnerable and ensuring that the darkness remained concealed. The realization sent shockwaves through the community. The horror was no longer confined to the forest or the cabin, but was inseparable from the town itself. Institutions, homes, and even daily routines were now seen through a lens of suspicion, as if every corner of Millfield might bear witness to the unseen forces that had governed the Pritchards' lives for generations. In confronting this truth, investigators understood that the Pritchards' legacy could not simply be eradicated or contained. The darkness they had perpetuated was woven into the town's identity, a haunting presence that would endure long after the children were rescued and the ruins explored. The forest, the symbols, the tunnels, and even the people who had remained silent all formed part of a system that had survived decades, feeding on fear, secrecy, and the unspoken complicity of the town itself. Millfield now faced a reality that could not be ignored. The Pritchards' horrors were not anomalies, and the forest's darkness was not confined to a single family. The town had inherited the consequences of generations of silence, and the revelation of the Pritchard cycle exposed an enduring, pervasive evil that would forever alter the way its residents viewed the ground beneath their feet, the trees at the edge of the forest, and the very history they had long taken for granted.